Hello, so I recently finished watching Sound and Fury and its sequel called 6 Years Later. And I actually found it very interesting how, although these films are relatively short, they kind of changed my perception on a couple of things. But before I get into it, I'll kind of explain how the movies were set up. So, in the first movie, Sound and Fury, it's set up as a documentary and it follows the lives of two families. So, the first family has parents that can hear and they have a deaf child. And in the second family, we have two deaf parents that also have a deaf child. And so we get to see like the different ways in which these families react to them having a deaf kid. I will say it is important not to generalize though. So although these families react a certain way, it doesn't mean that every deaf parent or every parent that can hear will react the way these people reacted. But it is interesting because we get like a glimpse of the possible ways in which they would react. Now, kind of like on a similar note, I will say that a major theme in this movie was whether getting a cochlear implant was a good decision or not. There were a lot of fights, especially in the first movie, a lot of fights between people that could hear and like the deaf people, and whether like getting a cochlear implant was the right thing to do or not. And so at first I didn't understand why that was such a big deal, but later on I understood that in the deaf community it's kind of frowned upon to get a cochlear implant for yourself or your kid, because it's kind of seen as like you're switching over to like the other side, or like you're betraying your identity. And so I I didn't understand this at first, but that's mainly due to the fact that I did have quite a few preconceived notions on deaf individuals. So I assumed that being able to hear was like a huge privilege. I assumed that every deaf individual wanted to have the ability to hear, so much so to the point where even like I thought that most of them might have some type of like internalized depression because they didn't like that part of themselves, or they wanted to change it. And this was completely wrong. Again, there were a bunch of instances which I realized like, oh, okay, deaf individuals are completely fine being deaf and it's part of their identity. One example would be in the first movie, Sound and Fury. In minute 2, we have Peter, which is one of the dads, and he sets up a hypothetical and he says like, if somebody were to offer me a magical pill that could give me the ability to hear, like, would I take it? And he says no. Like he's like, no, I wouldn't take it. I'm fine the way I am. Like, this is who I am and I wouldn't change it. And so again, that was like super interesting to me, but I didn't expect it because I assumed that everyone that was deaf wanted to hear. But I'm glad I learned this, because this is going to help me out with what I want to study later on in life. So with that being said, I do want to be a speech pathologist. And so I actually got to see, I would say in the second movie, there's a scene in minute 20 where I truly got to see how like all of this would tie into what I want to study later on. We have a speech therapist actually helping out one of the kids, so Heather, and a bunch of other kids. And I got to see like the ways in which I would probably have to be with the people I want to help. So because I want to work with kids, I'm most likely going to have to play games with them, just like they did. And I'm going to have to understand that people that have cochlear implants, especially if they got them later on in life, there's going to be certain words that they can't pronounce. So for example, in this scene that I'm talking about, we have Heather. She tries to pronounce the word jump and she can't say it. Like, she can't say the j in jump. She says like shump, and the speech therapist corrects her. But later on when she says Simon as like Shyman, the speech therapist doesn't correct her, and that's due to the fact that the speech therapist knows Heather and she knows that she has her limits and there's just going to be certain words that she can't pronounce. So yeah. And another interesting fact though that many knew but I kind of learned a little bit better after watching these movies and like reading chapter 2 and chapter 4 would be that American Sign Language is its own language, and it is not spoken English being like translated into like sign language. If you do want to translate each individual like spoken English word verbatim, it would be known as signed English. But American Sign Language is its own language, and so that was kind of interesting, and I also didn't know that. So yeah, thank you.